In the previous video, we explored the set of practices that begin at verse 24 of the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra and noted that verses 24 to 27 form a single continuous practice, each verse complementing and extending the instruction of the previous one. Nevertheless, traditional commentators generally count each of these verses as an individual dharana, and we will follow that convention in order to preserve the classical sequence of 112 dharanas. Continuing in this spirit, in today's video, we turn to the next set of verses and deepen our study of these subtle and ancient methods. Verse 28. Concentrate on the Shakti arising from the root like the rays of the sun, gradually becoming subtler and subtler, until at last she dissolves in the Dvadashanta and Bhairava manifests. This dharana centers on Prana Shakti in its latent form, Prana Kundalini. Classical texts describe Kundalini as coiled in folds within the Muladhara, symbolizing her latent potential before awakening. In this practice, the yogin contemplates this inner power and the possibility of its sudden, lightning-like ascent. Commentators traditionally approach this experience from two complementary perspectives. From the non-dual Shaiva viewpoint, the instantaneous rise is not a forced physiological event, but a flash of recognition, an inward leap of awareness through the central channel, culminating in the Dvadashanta, the 0.12 finger breadths above the crown. In this moment, Kundalini is understood as the power of consciousness itself, and her ascent signifies the sudden recognition of one's own luminous nature, prakasha. From the more yogic energetic perspective, the description refers to an actual rapid ascent of Kundalini Shakti. This interpretation takes the verse literally. Unlike the gradual chakra-by-chakra rise associated with many hatha yogic systems, this dharana contemplates an immediate vertical surge through the sushumna, bypassing intermediate centers. Upon reaching the Dvadashanta, the highest subtle point where consciousness fully manifests, Kundalini dissolves into the radiant expanse of pure awareness, in which the nature of Bhairava becomes evident. Such descriptions of an abrupt ascent of Kundalini must be approached with care. Traditional sources consistently warn that forcibly driving Kundalini upward without proper preparation can cause uncontrollable agitation, emotional instability, hallucinations, and other mental or physical disorders. In fact, a genuinely rapid rise of Kundalini occurring naturally is unlikely in an unprepared person. In beginners, the pranic channels are not yet purified, the mind is not stable or concentrated enough, and the necessary grounding and inner strength have not been established. For this reason, the true danger usually arises not from meditation itself, but from attempts to provoke the ascent artificially, through aggressive breathing, external artificial stimuli, or the use of drugs. Such attempts can disrupt the natural flow of prana, leading to anxiety, heat in the body, erratic emotions, insomnia, or a sense of energetic disorientation. By contrast, the traditional and safer approach to Kundalini for beginners involves a gradual ascent through the chakras, supported by systematic work at each level, moral discipline, breath training, steady concentration, and purification of the nadis. In this sequential model, Kundalini rises only when the corresponding centers are ready to receive it, and each chakra is stabilized before the energy moves upward. This grounded, progressive method allows the practitioner to integrate the effects of awakening at every stage, in stark contrast to the sudden, non-sequential ascent contemplated in this dharana, which is intended for practitioners who are already stable, experienced, and internally prepared. Verse 29. Meditate on that Shakti rising upward like lightning, passing through all the chakras one by one until it reaches the Dvadashanta. Then the radiant form of Bhairava appears. Unlike the previous verse, which describes the emergence of Kundalini as an instantaneous surge, this dharana presents a sequential ascent. The comparison to lightning indicates a series of momentary and clearly defined perceptions. According to Swami Lakshmanju, the practitioner is instructed to observe Shakti rising in distinct stages, from the pelvic center to the navel, from the navel to the heart, from the heart to the throat, from the throat to the space between the eyebrows, and from there to the Brahmarandra. According to Swami Lakshmanju's commentary, the ascent described in this verse unfolds through a sequence of Devadasantas, internal intervals symbolically defined as 12 finger widths each. At each interval, the movement of prana kundalini produces a brief flash of awareness before rising to the next, and when this ascent reaches the upper Devadasanta, Urdhva Devadasanta, the process culminates in Mahodaya, the direct recognition of Bhairava. Lakshmanju distinguishes this mode of upward movement as prana kundalini, the energetic form of Shakti associated with yogic effort and susceptible to interruption when attention becomes disturbed or attached to particular points. When the same upward movement occurs without intentional effort and proceeds continuously, it is described as Chit Kundalini, the rise of pure consciousness. In such cases, the movement is unobstructed and self-propelled. Although the stages correspond to anatomical regions associated with the chakra system, the dharana does not involve focusing on chakras or dwelling on them. Its purpose is to track the successive internal intervals through which the ascending current moves until it reaches the upper Devadasanta, where the recognition described as Mahodaya takes place. Verse 30. The 12 centers should be pierced successively through proper understanding of their 12 letters. Freed from the gross and then the subtle, one by one, at the end of its journey the Kundalini becomes Shiva. Verse 30 describes a structured method of inner ascent based on the sequential piercing of 12 subtle centers, each associated with one of the 12 Sanskrit vowels. Swami Lakshmanju explains that these 12 points mark 12 progressive stages, or kramas, beginning from the lowest limit of embodied awareness and culminating in 2 trans-cerebral phases located above the crown of the head. The series proceeds through Janmagra, Mula, Kanda, Nabhi, Hridaya, Kantha, Talu, Bhumadhya, Lalata, and Brahmarandra, concluding with the 2 upper stages known as Shakti and Vyapani. Although other Trika sources describe additional microcenters, such as Samana, Unmana, and the Devadasanta itself, these belong to a more refined phase of ascent that extends beyond the scope of this verse. In those higher stages, the movement of Kundalini is no longer conceptualized in terms of discrete centers, but as a progressive dissolution of the individual locus of awareness into pure, undivided consciousness. Verse 30 restricts itself to the 12-fold sequence ending with Vyapani, which completes the cycle of vowel stages relevant to this specific dharana. Each of the 12 stages is linked to a Sanskrit vowel that functions as its subtle essence. The correspondences are as follows: Janmagra with A, Mula with A, long, Kanda with I, Nabhi with I, long, Hridaya with U, Kantha with U, long, Talu with E, Bhumadhya with I, Lalata with O, Brahmarandra with Au, Shakti with Am, and Vyapani with A. The practice consists not in focusing on the gross anatomical point, but on the vibration of its corresponding vowel, which serves to shift attention from the physical center to its subtle sonic form. The verse states that the practitioner proceeds from the gross to the subtle. Lakshmanju explains that this means the physical locus becomes transparent once its vowel essence is recognized. When attention rests in the vibration of the vowel, the gross dimension loses its binding capacity, and the center becomes accessible to further penetration. The vowel is therefore not a symbolic association, but a functional element of the practice. It is the subtle frequency through which each center is traversed. According to Lakshmanju, each stage unfolds through 3 phases. The first is dhyana, in which attention is stabilized and primarily connected with the breath. The second is spanda-manita, the recognition of a subtle pulsation or inner movement that arises when breath awareness concentrates. The third is jyotirupata, the emergence of a refined, self-luminous awareness in which the center ceases to appear as a location and becomes a mode of consciousness. As one progresses through the sequence, each center becomes more subtle, and the sense of embodied individuality weakens correspondingly. The ascent reaches its culmination in the stages of Shakti and Vyapani. In the stage called Shakti, the rising current passes beyond the Brahmarandra and enters the subtle ether above the head. In the stage of Vyapani, this current expands outward and loses all directional structure. Consciousness no longer rises toward a point, but spreads uniformly in every direction. At this point, the distinction between the ascending energy, the centers through which it ascends, and the awareness observing the process dissolves. When the 12th stage is completed, Kundalini is no longer understood as movement, but as the inherent luminosity of consciousness itself, identical with Shiva. This practice is classified as a lower form of Jnana Upaya, not because it is elementary, but because it proceeds step by step rather than through instantaneous recognition. In reality, it is one of the most refined methods described in the text, integrating subtle anatomy, mantra, breath, and the recognition of spanda. Within Trika Shaivism, the practice presupposes a certain maturity of attention and a developed sensitivity to inner subtle processes. Interpreted through the lens of Kundalini-based practice, this dharana requires that the inner channels be clear and that the practitioner already be familiar with subtle energy. Without such preparation, visualizing the ascent of Kundalini through all 12 centers may be ineffective or even destabilizing. When the proper foundation is present, however, this dharana functions as a precise and systematic pathway through which awareness can move from the most condensed level of embodiment to the universal state of Shiva. Going beyond the discussion of this verse, we will also reflect in more detail on the concept of Kundalini, since until now I have touched on it only briefly and in passing on this channel. Across the many Indian yogic and tantric traditions, the awakening and ascent of Kundalini is treated as a subtle, multidimensional process rooted in a shared theoretical framework, but expressed through markedly different methods. At the core of this framework lies the understanding that Kundalini is the condensed form of the universal Shakti, resting in potential at the base of the subtle body. Her upward movement is understood as the progressive refinement of consciousness, prana, and awareness through the central channel, accompanied by the dissolution of inner knots and the gradual illumination of the centers of perception. Because these processes involve the subtle body, traditions naturally develop diverse ways to activate, concentrate, direct, and refine energy and consciousness. Visualization is one of the most widespread methods, especially in tantric systems. Practitioners concentrate on the subtle body's architecture, visualizing the central channel, chakras, nadis, and the rising of the inner force. In some traditions, the imagery is simple, a column of light or the expansion of a void-like space, while in others it becomes highly detailed, involving lotus forms, specific colors, elemental symbols, seed letters, inner deities, or geometric diagrams. Mantric practice offers a parallel and equally important pathway. Some traditions rely on bija mantras associated with each chakra: Lam, Vam, Ram, Yan, Ham, Sham, and Om, each thought to resonate with a specific vibrational stratum of the subtle body. Other systems go further, assigning syllables to each petal of the chakra lotus. In the classical tantric model, for example, the petals of the chakras bear Sanskrit phonemes, and reciting or contemplating these sounds is considered a way to activate dormant potentials. Different lineages map these sounds differently. Some emphasize the vowels as indicators of subtle vibrations. Others use full mantras or seed syllables associated with specific deities or forces that preside over the chakra in question. Still others, such as certain Kaula and Natha traditions, use esoteric phonetic formulas that function as sound ladders, guiding the ascent through progressively more refined layers of sound consciousness until Kundalini naturally rises. Beyond mantras and visualization, breath-based techniques constitute another major category. Pranayama in its various forms, alternate nostril breathing, kumbhaka, retention, ujjayi, bhastrika, and other regulated patterns, works by balancing, intensifying, or slowing prana to create inner stillness and awaken latent forces. In many traditions, kumbhaka stills the outward movement of prana. When prana becomes quiet, balanced, and inward drawn, conditions are created in the central channel for the rise of Kundalini. Some systems, such as those in the Natha and Hatha yoga traditions, combine breath with bandhas, energetic locks, and mudras, energetic gestures, the most famous being Mahamudra, Mahaveda, and Kachari. These techniques apply subtle physical pressure and energetic redirection to reverse the downward flow of prana and draw it into the central channel. Contemplative methods also exist, especially in non-dual traditions. Here, the emphasis is not on generating inner movements, but on recognizing the ever-present nature of consciousness. Texts like the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, when read through the lens of Kashmir Shaivism, present methods where the ascent of Kundalini occurs spontaneously through intensified awareness, dissolution of thoughts, and recognition of the inner void or the gap between breaths. Although these practices do not manipulate energy in the classical manner, the inner transformation they produce is described as indistinguishable from the awakening of Kundalini, viewed not as a literal movement, but as the unfolding of one's inherent Shakti. There are also devotional and ritual methods. In Shakta traditions, especially those aligned with Sri Vidya or certain forms of Kali worship, the awakening of Kundalini may be supported through mantra japa dedicated to the goddess, ritual worship, visualization of yantras, and internalized puja. These methods rely on the power of devotion, surrender, and symbolic internalization to soften the boundaries of the ego and open the subtle centers. In Bhakti-influenced yogas, the focus on the heart center through continuous remembrance of the divine name can result in spontaneous awakening experiences, described in language that closely parallels tantric accounts, even if framed differently. In essence, Kundalini is a conceptual framework used to describe a set of subtle physiological, energetic, and consciousness-transforming processes, but different traditions use different vocabulary to refer to the same or closely related inner dynamics. However, if Kundalini is associated specifically with the ascending flow of uncontaminated Shakti energy along Sushumna, then in other practices there are other ways of manifesting the same energy, such as descending flows of Shakti energy from above, which are characteristic of experiences in Bhakti. The term Kundalini belongs primarily to certain tantric, Natha, Kaula, and Shakta lineages, where the rising of this inner power is mapped through chakras, nadis, petals, seed syllables, and stages of ascent. However, other traditions that never mention Kundalini nonetheless describe experiences that correspond closely to what these systems outline. Early Buddhist texts speak of purifying the inner winds. Taoist alchemy describes the ascent of inner fire through the meridians. Certain yogic Upanishads describe prana rising through the central channel of the nadis. And Christian mystics speak of an interior fire or light, often experienced in the heart as a burning sweetness. While the symbolic language differs, fire, wind, light, breath, void, sound, serpent, the underlying processes they attempt to describe often point to the same phenomena: the reorganization of subtle energies, the stabilization of attention, and the opening of deeper states of consciousness. In this sense, Kundalini is one theological and symbolic model among several, but the experiential and physiological shifts it depicts are not confined to one tradition. They represent a broad range of inner transformations that many traditions acknowledge, even if they interpret them through different metaphysical frameworks.